Boxing is back on network television. We are making the rounds right here on ESPN.com. I'm Jim Baswell. Dan Rayfield will join us in a moment. NBC enters the fight game with Heyman Boxing, the company headed by powerful advisor and manager Al Heyman, and will air 20 cards in 2015. The first card will take place on March 7th in Las Vegas with a co-feature of Adrian Broner taking on John Molina and then Keith Thurman facing Robert Guerrero. Dan Rayfield, ESPN Boxing Insider, joins us over the phone. Dan, what are the details of this deal?
Well, Jim, first of all, this has been something that's been speculated about and swirling around for a number of months with details, but we didn't know what the actual fights were and how many events there were going to be on which platforms. But they unveiled it on Wednesday at a press conference in New York. It's called Premier Boxing Champions. That's the name of the series. Like you said, 20 cards in 2015, but the big part of it, while 9 of those cards will take place on NBC's sports cable network, the rest of them are going to take place on NBC proper, and 6 of them will be on Saturday afternoons, but 5 of them will be in prime time on Saturday night, which is a big deal for boxing, which hasn't been in prime time on network television for decades.
Absolutely.
And they've kicked it off. You mentioned the first card. They also announced the second card, which will take place April 11th at a site to be determined. A junior welterweight unification between the champ Danny Garcia and title holder Lamont Peterson, a fight that we've wanted to see in boxing for quite some time.
Yeah,
big day for boxing.
Absolutely. I remember back in the day when I was a youngin' when Sugar Ray Leonard won the welterweight title, beating Benitez, and that I think was on NBC, if I'm not mistaken. It was network TV, free TV. Imagine that.
Let me tell you, Jim, it's interesting that you mentioned Sugar Ray Leonard like you did. And one of the reasons why all these years after he retired, he still resonates with the public is because he fought so many of his fights on network television. And guess who's going to be one of the color commentators for the show? It's going to be Sugar Ray Leonard doing these events. And in terms of the network fights, not the sports network fights, but the main network fights, the blow-by-blow man is going to be the great Al Michaels, who has a lot of experience doing boxing when he worked at ABC. And, of course, most people now know him as the voice of NBC's football franchise. But Al is a knowledgeable and good boxing announcer, and he brings a lot of gravitas to the sport when he's on the call.
Yeah, Dan, just from a magnitude standpoint, how big a deal is this to have a high-profile fights back on network TV?
It's a big deal because as much as there have been a lot of great fights over the years on the premium cable networks, many of the biggest fights in the history of the sport over the last 35 years or so between HBO and Showtime. The reality is, if you want to watch those fights, you have to pay an extra fee per month, and they're only in between 20 and 30 million homes. Showtime in about 21, 22 million homes. HBO is maybe in about 28 million homes. That's a lot of people, of course. But NBC, everybody gets NBC. You put your TV on, and you have it. It doesn't matter, you stick the antenna up or you plug your TV in, and you're going to be able to watch a boxing event, if you so desire, on that network. And, I think it's a little overrated because pretty much most people that watch television these days, they do have some kind of basic cable where you would still get those channels, such as ESPN, but it's still a big deal.
Absolutely. Dan, what do you suppose the overall impact of this will have on the world of boxing moving forward?
Well, I think you have to look and make sure that these high-quality matches continue to do that. Of course, they come out of the gate. They announced some very significant and interesting fights that we've wanted to see. The question is, can they continue to do that? The commitment, my understanding, is a minimum of 2 years, 20 cards a year in this series. So far, the first 2 they've announced obviously look very quality. But one thing I think people should remember, and this is not a normal thing in the sports television business, is that unlike most sports properties where the network televises the event, the network pays hefty money to do it. Look, ESPN is in that business. We pay all kinds of money for the rights fees that we have with various leagues and network and college conferences and that sort of thing. In this case, the Heyman Boxing people, with investors backing them, are paying NBC for the time, so upwards of $20 million a year. And that doesn't even include all of the millions of dollars that are earmarked towards promotion and marketing of the event. So, they're hopeful that at some point they can bring boxing back in a big enough way where they can turn it into a profitable endeavor. But for the time being, they're paying for it, and, thankfully they're putting on some quality events. The bottom line for boxing fans, though, putting all the politics aside and all the stuff about who's paying for what, at the end of the day, in the first day, they've announced 3 quality matchups.
Absolutely. Boxing is back on network TV, and that network is NBC. For more on this story, keep it locked to the boxing page here on ESPN.com. For ESPN Boxing Insider Dan Rayfield, I'm Jim Baswell.